Well, hello everyone, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. You know, among all things that I was going to be talking about today, this is definitely not something that I really expected to see. Travis King, the US soldier who crossed into North Korea. We actually had a soldier defect, or at least we're not going to exactly say the word defect, but who went across the border to North Korea, which, I mean, I guess from anything that's defecting when he's left the Western world and gone to that state. This whole thing is just weird. A US soldier who crossed into North Korea on Tuesday did so, and I quote, willfully and without authorization. According to US and international officials, he is now believed to be in the custody of North Korea. That's just not something that I would have expected to happen here this week, not at all. The man, whom a US Army spokesperson identified as Travis King, was a private second class who had been released from a detention center in South Korea as he was scheduled to be flown home to the United States when he somehow returned to South Korea, joined a tour group to the demilitarized zone, and then ran across the heavily fortified border. Okay, well now guys, as I said, this whole thing is a little bit confusing, so I'm going to kind of give an overview of what it is that we know, and I'm also going to provide a bit of an explanation for why we are talking about this here in the first place, because this whole thing is very interesting when we're talking about things in historical context. But first off, before we begin, I wanted to do two things. I'm actually extremely angered and frustrated right now with what happened with my previous video, the one that I did on the censorship of All Quiet on the Western Front, because I'm sure that a number of you have already seen my community post, but it really is the greatest irony that after 2 days of work, and not one, not two, not three, not four different versions, I made 5 different attempts to make this video. Each time continuously running into issues when I would upload it where it just wasn't suitable for advertisers or was outright removed by YouTube. That in a video that is about the censorship that this massive historical grand piece of literature received, I myself was ultimately censored for it. This video, and this is where it really does bother me here, and it's going to change how it is that I have to operate on this channel in the future, I'm sure. It is easily the biggest video that I have posted in the past month, and as the channel is growing and more things like this occur, the reality of it is that I'm putting a lot more time and effort into singular videos that are longer. I'm not making nearly as many of these smaller videos that are released 4 times a week or more, which means that if one of these videos gets censored and I don't get paid for it, that is something that really does hurt me. I specifically was trying to teach people about the censorship of a great piece of literature, and you decided to censor it yourself. The irony cannot be lost in this situation. But on a more positive note, precisely because this is the biggest video that I'd posted in the past month, I wanted to thank you all, the viewers, everyone who has been supporting me. I want to continue to make the videos that I'm doing on subjects that are probably not going to necessarily be safe for YouTube, so the fact that I have as many people as I do supporting me on Patreon makes me incredibly happy. Thank you, all of you. And the more support that I receive, the more likely I am to be able to create more things. My plan is to revamp Patreon from the ground up, and so for all of you who have supported me, I thank you. I'm going to be changing up how I'm doing things specifically to suit it for YouTube. So if you all want to support me, I would greatly appreciate it if you click the links down in my description in order to help me out, because honestly, who knows what's going to be happening with the YouTube censors. It's exceptionally frustrating. But anyway, you are not here to see me moan and complain about all this crap, oh no. No, instead of talking about German censorship in World War II, we're going to be talking about the significantly safer subject, North Korea, because somehow that applies. So really the only thing that we know right now is specifically what we have been able to be told by officials. The gist is that this is Private Second Class Travis King, and he is a guy who has been a cavalry scout in the US Army since January of 2021. He is a 23-year-old man who had been stationed in South Korea, but unfortunately he had a little bit of a run-in with the law as he had just finished serving a 2-month prison sentence in South Korea. Or I say finished, but that's not precisely the case. There was a little bit more to this that was going on. You see, the reason why that had happened is that according to several South Korean media outlets, King had gone and punched a South Korean national while they were at a club, this being an event that occurred in the previous year's September. And as a result of that, he had been fined around 5 million won, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you look at the actual value of the South Korean currency, this is something that's the equivalent of around like 4 grand. Or for those of you who might be wondering in Europe, like 4,000 American dollars. defectors. But this wasn't just for the assault, it was simultaneously because when the man was arrested, he also caused a lot of public damage and was very uncooperative with police when he was arrested. According to account by the Chosun Ilbo newspaper, King yelled obscenities at the South Korean police as he kicked the doors on the interior of the police car. Not sure if he was trying to break out at that time, but he was definitely very uncooperative and was trying to fight his way out. Following this 2-month stint in prison, King was then released to US officials at the military hub in the country about a week or so ago. But what ended up happening to King was that as he was being escorted to an airport outside of Seoul, he actually managed to escape. The reason why he was going there in the first place was that he was supposed to be boarding a plane that was bound for Fort Bliss, Texas, where he was going to be facing disciplinary military action. Naturally speaking, since we're talking about a prisoner, officials had escorted him through the airport, and they got him all the way through security, but somehow, and we're really not sure as to why or how this happened, King managed to ditch his escort as they had passed security, and then was able to make his way out of the terminal. From there, and we're still not exactly sure how this happened, he managed to make his way all the way up to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, and that is where officials say that King, who was dressed in civilian clothes, was then able to join a tour of the Korean border village of Panmunjom, or Panmunjom. It's probably all one word, and I'm just mispronouncing it when I say that here. There's way less preparatory work going into this video, just as a heads up. As for what happened next, well, one member of the tour group described the incident in a Facebook post that has now actually been deleted, so I can't pull that up, that says that while there, King apparently laughed loudly and then proceeded to run through 2 buildings and eventually just crossed the border into North Korea, and everyone could not stop him. No one had any idea what was going on. When he joined this, he was one of around 43 tourists that were there at the village, and a couple of them apparently thought that he was doing this for like some kind of viral TikTok stunt, which I gotta say, among all things that I have seen on TikTok, there's a lot of really stupid things, and I mean a lot of stupid things, considering that is where I got my career on social media started. But while there have been a lot of stupid challenges, I don't believe that crossing the heavily fortified demilitarized zone is ever one that even the dumbest member of our society would ever try to achieve as just a prank, bro. Then again, considering what I've covered in human history, I probably shouldn't be doubtful of what humans are capable of. But yeah, what ended up happening is that he made his move at the end of the tour and disappeared down a narrow passageway between the DMZ's famous blue buildings before the soldiers that were standing guard had any ability to just react to the situation. Some of the tourist group would report that, yeah, they didn't see really any guards on the other side with the North Korean side because there just had been fewer since the whole COVID-19 pandemic of the previous years. We still don't know whether or not this whole thing was actually something that was planned by King or whether or not he just did it on a whim. The whole thing is just exceptionally confusing. And as for where King is now, well, we don't 100% know, but that's kind of how things go whenever it comes to stuff with North Korea. During a press conference this past Tuesday, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin would say that officials believe that King is in the custody of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, for anyone who is not recognizing things just based off the name. Yes, I know it is terribly ironic that they call themselves the Democratic People's Republic. That's just how these things kind of work. But so far, there really has been no word from North Korea regarding the matter. I checked today, and there's still nothing. Considering what is going on in international politics right now, this is something that is going to be a fresh diplomatic challenge for Washington's relationship with North Korea, something that has always been kind of tenuous at best. After all, still to this day, the United States does not have any formal diplomatic relations with North Korea. It's all officially been cut off. But what is more than likely going to happen from this is that the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, is going to end up using this for diplomatic pressure points or for some kind of political gain. Like, it would not be surprising if any of that happened, because this is something that has happened repeatedly over the years. Not with, like, soldiers, that's a very rare incident, but definitely with foreign nationals and US civilians. I mean, the last time that any of this happened was back in 2018 when you had Bruce Brian Lawrence, who illegally entered the country from China. And this was a guy who ended up being held by North Korea for only around a month when he was released, which is not the worst in comparison to the previous cases of when this stuff happened. And before that, we had Tony Kim, a Korean-American professor, and Kim Hak-song, a former South Korean politician who also held US citizenship. Both of these guys were detained in 2017 and ended up being released around a year later. So a little bit longer, but also still not the worst in comparison to what has previously happened. Their release would come on the same day as another American by the name of Kim Dong-chul, who had been held since 2015. So the three of these guys were then set free during during a visit to North Korea by then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and this was ahead of the anticipated summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump that was set to occur later that year. Arguably one of the bigger and more high-profile cases was the detainment of Otto Warmbier, which, if you all remember when that whole thing happened back in 2016, this was the guy who was a US college student who was on tour of the country when he was detained. He was accused of taking a poster from his hotel room and was, well, held in prison essentially for more than a year. Ultimately, he would be eventually released to US officials, but at that point, he was in a coma and would pass away just days after returning to the United States. Still something that is exceptionally controversial. But guys, I'm telling you this right now, this is a very different case than any of the stuff that we just previously listed. This is not a civilian. This is a US soldier. And I know that what we're talking about right now is news, and normally I'm not a person that is a commentator that is going to tell things about the news. That's not my job or position. It has been over 40 years since anything like that happened, and that's the reason why I wanted to talk about this here. This is a very big deal, and the history of that and the previous defections is what makes this case just so incredibly fascinating. What is more than likely happening right now is that North Korean officials are probably interrogating King in order to try and determine what to do with him. Because in the past, what has happened with US soldiers who have defected to North Korea is that many of them have been imprisoned, but also what has ended up happening is that a bunch of them end up being used for like propaganda reels and things like that. Like, I want to pull up a clip of this, which I have right here, but I'm not going to end up showing it because I don't want this whole thing to be taken down by YouTube again, so I'm just going to have this still image here in the background. But in many different circumstances, they end up using these soldiers for movies where they star as either just themselves or general US soldier whatever, so that they can depict American soldiers in as negative light as they possibly can, you know, for their own productions. And when I'm talking about those propaganda films, it really is funny because they really have only had like a couple people that they could use for these roles time and time again. It's like the equivalent of what? You see Tom Cruise or like Ryan Gosling or literally any of the other people that you see repeated time and time again and stuff, but it's like the exact same roles and they're not doing anything different. Because when you're looking at these guys, only around half a dozen American service members have crossed the border since the Korean War. And that is since 1953, right? Like, there haven't really been all that many. And this is a small group that you can see the image behind me here that has all of them kind of listed on this. This is something that's still, to this day, 70 years later, is still a big deal for North Korean propaganda that is still utilized. With the last big case of this, as I said, having happened 4 decades earlier in 1982. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself when I'm talking about this. We need to go a little bit back into the actual story of these guys. That is why I wanted to talk about this. I wanted to go into the history of all the different times that we had the North Korean defectors. Except in the opposite end, because it's not the North Koreans defecting to, you know, South Korea and the United States. It's the reverse with soldiers. The first of all these guys that we're going to be talking about is Private Larry Abshir. Abshir was actually the first US soldier to defect to North Korea, and he did so back in the year 1962. At the time, the man was only 19 years old. What had happened in his case was that he had been deployed to South Korea the previous year, but he was caught smoking substances that he wasn't supposed to be, and this apparently occurred multiple times. And so the army was going to court-martial him, but he didn't want to wait for that to actually happen. So instead of going back to his old life in the States and potentially getting dishonorably discharged, he instead decided, you know what, no, I'm just going to go over to North Korea, as I guess every smart decision-making person would do. The testimony of this actually comes from James Joseph Dresnock, who is the second soldier that we're going to be talking about after this, and both he and Abshir were like the first guys to go over. Eventually, they were going to be joined by 2 more Americans, Corporal Jerry Wayne Parrish in December of 1963, and Sergeant Charles Robert Jenkins in January of 1965, which all of these guys and their individual stories we are going to cover here in just a second. All 4 of these guys would end up living in a 2-bedroom house that was just outside of Pyongyang, and there they were forced to study the writings of North Korean leaders and ideology and everything that you could possibly imagine then with, you know, North Korea. Of course, in order to re-educate them, they would be subjected to more physical teachings, including beatings, because, you know, their spirits, of course, had to be broken to be reshaped into something that fit the North Korean state. Of course, being such valuable tools, they would also, as I said, feature prominently at a lot of the propaganda of the time, and so magazines, movies, any kind of other productions that you could imagine, these guys were a part of it because, well, very useful tool to have actual American soldiers who can play Westerners versus the same standard North Korean person that would be wearing makeup in order to try and imitate things. The men in turn became famous for playing evil Americans in what was a 20-part film series that made in North Korea called Nameless Heroes. This was such a big deal that in North Korea, these men were not referred to as their actual names by the majority of the public. They were instead referred to by their characters because that's what everyone knew them as. Like, even decades later, it's the equivalent of what you would see within America if like Sylvester Stallone was just continuously referred to as Rocky. The lot of them were apparently offered North Korean citizenship back in the year 1972. And when one of them asked, okay, well, what happens if we refused? Apparently a North Korean official then responded, well, you won't be here tomorrow then. Which is rather ominous, and we would say, okay, well, that was a threat, but no, it could mean that they were just released, or it could also mean that they just wouldn't exist the next day. You don't really know. There's not really much else to say about Abshir's story except that he would die in the year 1983 at the age of 40. And while he had grown up in Ohio, his tombstone would for some reason list Pyongyang as his birthplace. But besides that, that's really the end of his individual story. And now for Dresnok. Dresnok's story is a little bit more interesting because, quite frankly, he did significantly more, including dashing across the border in broad daylight back in the year 1962, just apparently out of frustration. He was divorced and he was serving on the DMZ stakeout post, and he was about to be court-martialed because what he had just done was he had forged his sergeant's signature in order to be able to go and visit a woman that he was seeing. According to him, he would say, and I quote, "I was fed up with my childhood, my marriage, my military life, everything. There's only one place to go." Which, no, sir, there were many other places to go. You chose to go to North Korea, which for most people is not the first decision that they're going to make in that scenario. All of this information that I'm talking about would be revealed in the 2006 documentary Crossing the Line. And when this documentary was released back in 2006, of course, since it's been like, what, almost 30 years since any defections had taken place, he was depicted as being the last American to defect. Though now, of course, we've just broken that whole thing. It's actually an interesting note because according to the filmmakers who made this documentary, when they went and interviewed this guy, Dresnok joined North Korea in 1962, and the last time that he had ever actually been to America was 3 years previously in 1959. So his accent, his dialects, just the way that he spoke, his knowledge, everything about him was like something straight out of a time capsule. It had evolved and changed without any kind of external American influences. So all the different elements like landing on the moon, the Cuban Missile Crisis, literally everything that was occurring in the big tumultuous time period of the 60s, all of that passed him, and he had like really no idea about a number of things. Another interesting point about him is that although a bunch of the other defectors would come to regret their decision of going to join North Korea, Dresnok was the opposite. He said, and I quote, that he would not leave North Korea if you put a damn $1 billion of gold on the table. Like, he just was not going to leave. It was his home now. And despite the fact that he had been re-educated, he seemed to actually maintain a large degree of his individuality, with one of the things that they learned at the time being that he still regularly enjoyed to just go fishing. But of course, his story still gets even weirder because what ended up happening him personally is that Dresnok married a woman while he was in North Korea, except at first it wasn't a North Korean woman, it was a Romanian woman, a woman by the name of Doina Bumbi. And this was a Romanian painter who at the time was actually tricked into traveling to Pyongyang, and so she was abducted by the North Koreans. From this, it seems, specifically in order to be the wife of him, which is just an incredibly twisted and dark thing to happen. But we're going to talk about more of these cases because that is not the first or only time that happened. That was a regular thing that North Korea has done over the years. Over the course of his entire life, he would stick by North Korea, and it would be in the year 2017 that the two sons that he had with that Romanian woman would end up releasing a video stating that he died of a stroke in the previous year of 2016. And that really was the end of him. All right, next up on the list, we have Corporal Jerry Wayne Parrish. His is a story that is a rather shorter one. He was 19 years old when he was patrolling the demilitarized zone in 1963 when he just inexplicably dropped all of his supplies and ran across the border. He apparently left a note on top of his rifle saying, "Tell my mother I love her. I'll be home someday. Tell my friends goodbye." Now, from all of this, and still to this day, we do not know why exactly it is that he crossed the border. Like, this was a guy who was completely different from the previous two cases. His record was unblemished. There was nothing on it. No substance abuse, no violence, no anything. He was a normal soldier. And so at the time, his mother was completely convinced that he didn't cross willingly. He was abducted. Of course, that is not what the North Koreans would say. Radio Pyongyang, which is the broadcast service that would send out North Korean propaganda across the region, they would announce that the reason that he had joined North Korea was that he was concerned about his job prospects in the army. And he had heard that everyone in North Korea had a job, so clearly that was the best place to be. So he went. Like the others, he would also star in the varying different propaganda films and is generally regarded as being the best actor among all of them. Like, he would take on a large number of the roles and would perform them to a better degree than many of the others would. Over the course of his time there, he would then marry a Lebanese woman, and they would have 3 sons together, but that is pretty much the end of his story. We don't really know how it is that he died, as one of the men would end up reporting that he died in 1996 from an abdominal infection, but then that Crossing the Line documentary that we just talked about, that would say that he actually died from a kidney disease in 1998. So at some point in the late 90s, he would pass away, but we simply don't know how or really exactly when. Which then leads us to the last of the initial 4, Jenkins. Jenkins' story, in my opinion, is one of the funniest, if not also simultaneously one of the saddest ones that would occur, but also the one that would end the best among all of them. He was a guy who was stationed in South Korea in 1965 when, after having 10 beers, and so as you can imagine from that, he was incredibly intoxicated, he decided that he was going to walk across the border into North Korea in order to avoid being sent to Vietnam and have to fight. Which I will say, right now, among all the different things that we could be talking about, among all the different reasons that any of the previous people or those that could come after would give, this probably is something that makes the most sense. He didn't want to go to Vietnam to fight and die, so he just gave up and decided to join North Korea instead. The 24 U.S. sergeant, who was 24 years old at the time, would later on go to say that, yep, that was the biggest mistake of my life. He thought that what was going to happen to him was that he was going to be handed over to the Soviet Union, and then after some years there, that eventually he was going to be released in one of the semi-common prisoner exchanges that the Soviet Union had with the United States. So in other words, by waiting for potentially a few years in the Soviet Union, that he would avoid combat in Vietnam. That's what he thought was going to happen. He would later say, and I quote, "Yeah, I know I was not thinking clearly at the time, and a lot of my decisions really don't make sense now, but at the time they had a logic to them that made my actions seem almost inevitable." I almost from all this just kind of feel bad for the guy. So no, instead what would happen is that Jenkins was forced to spend the first 8 years in North Korea being held in a small room with those 3 other American detainees that we just talked about, where he was forced to read the works of North Korean leaders, and as we talked about earlier, was subject to frequent punishments, we're going to say. At one point, reportedly what happened is that the U.S. Army tattoo that he had on him was sliced off of him by a North Korean doctor without any kind of anesthetic whatsoever. Like the others, he would also appear in North Korea propaganda, movies, leaflets, all these different kinds of things, and he was specifically tasked with teaching English to North Korean spies and also military cadets so that they would be able to use those resources in order to be able to fight the Americans. And so several years after all of this is going down, he actually ends up getting married to a Japanese woman by the name of Hitomi Saga. This was an individual who was a Japanese citizen who had been kidnapped by North Korea as part of an effort to teach the Japanese language as well as culture to North Korean spies. Her story is actually very similar to what happened to the Romanian woman that we just previously talked about, except her story actually ends a little bit better. This whole thing is crazy because North Korea would actually admit in 2002 that over the course of the 70s and 80s, they kidnapped over a dozen people specifically from Japan in order to be able to do precisely this. Soga would actually be released to Japan in the year 2002, and Jenkins and their 2 daughters were actually allowed to join her in the year 2004, so only 2 years later. This being more than 39 years after he had initially crossed the border. And among the 4 from the initial, he is the only one who actually managed to survive. Of course, Jenkins was never actually kidnapped. He is someone who had willingly fled to North Korea and abandoned his duty, so now that he was actually back in the hands of the West, he was court-martialed. He would go on to plead guilty to desertion and aiding the enemy, and he ended up being demoted down to private and dishonorably discharged. He then spent 25 days in a U.S. military brig and was debriefed for 2 months about his knowledge of North Korea. Because, of course, even considering everything that happened and he did, he was still going to be a resource since he had insider knowledge. As for what would happen to him afterwards, he and his family would live on Japan's Sado Island, and there he would work as a greeter for a tourist attraction, really not bringing any kind of attention to himself. Over the years, reportedly, he never was able to stop looking over his shoulders for fear that the North Koreans would once again come after him, until eventually he would die at the age of 77 in 2017. Now, as I said earlier, these were the 4 individuals that that all went around the same time and were kept in the same house. Those were the initial 4, but there were still 2 others that came after them, with the first of these having been Private First Class Roy Chung. Unfortunately, I wasn't really able to find a lot of good images for this guy, so I'm just gonna have to kind of tell his story as it is with this image in the background. But the gist of it is that in 1979, Chung reportedly surfaced in North Korea after 2 months of going AWOL from his post, which you would think at this time, like, okay, so he was posted in South Korea, right? No, he disappeared from his unit in West Germany on the other side of the world. At the time, this 22-year-old South Korean immigrant wasn't actually a US citizen, but he had still joined the army in order to be able to get the educational benefits from it, and he had only joined in the previous year. At the time that all this went down, Chung was initially classified as a deserter because, you know, naturally like the previous guys, he just disappeared from duty. But the announcement that was given out by Pyongyang's radio, the propaganda network that we talked about for, leaves things to be a little bit more up in the air because it doesn't really make sense, especially considering where he was coming from. According to the Pyongyang radio, it said, and I quote, that Chung could no longer endure the disgraceful life of national insult and maltreatment he had to lead in the US imperialist aggressor army. Like it was some kind of insult to his Korean heritage or something. Chung's parents would of course tell the newspapers that they didn't believe this at all and that he had actually been abducted. And many people, naturally, were convinced that that was actually the case, that he had been abducted, as this had happened many times before to many other nationalities, as we already described, and especially to Koreans. It did not matter whether people were in Europe, in Japan, or any other kind of place, North Korean agents were all over the place and were actively kidnapping people. Like at the exact same time that this whole thing occurred in 1979, in April of that year, apparently a geology teacher from Seoul was attending a course in the Netherlands and was on vacation in Oslo, Norway, when he just disappeared. According to the newspapers that were covering all of this, his passport and an unmailed letter home were found on a city bus, and 2 months later, the teacher was reported by the North Koreans to be in the country, but because of naturally how all this went down, any of the South Korean citizens that were looking in on this were going, yeah, no, he was definitely kidnapped. Like, how else does one just appear from Oslo, Norway, disappear, and wind up in North Korea? And although obviously what we're talking about is speculation because we have no way to prove it, there have been multiple confirmed cases of exactly this happening, like a very high-profile case in which the Korean actress Choi Yoon-hui, she and her husband were kidnapped by North Korea in order to be able to make propaganda films for the Kim administration. Though honestly, covering that entire story is probably its own video in and of itself. So if that's something that you'd like to see, like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know in the comment section below, and I will definitely tell the full story of how that whole thing went down, because it is a big story. But yeah, unfortunately right there, that's kind of where the story of Roy Chung ends. We think he died around the year 2004, but there's really not much of else anything that we can say. That's just where everything kind of ends for him. And finally, that leads us to the last person on this list, the one that occurred over 40 years ago, Private Joseph T. White. White had defected back in August of 1982, and the way that he did this at the time was by shooting the lock off of a border guard gate and then simply just going and walking through it. At the time that he did this, newspaper incidents would cover the story saying that he was yelling in Korean, I'm coming, and then simultaneously calling for help. The eyewitness reports at the time would then go on to say that nearly a dozen North Korean soldiers would go and apprehend him and lead him to a bunker. Of course, everything that we're describing right now just outright sounds like, yes, he defected, and he defected willingly, but at home, his parents refused to believe that that was ever the case. His mother would describe him in an interview saying that no, he was gung-ho for the army, he was a patriot, and he was very pro-Reagan. There's no way in hell that this very American boy would ever go and abandon his country. After an investigation, North Korean propaganda leaflets were found in his belongings, but this isn't necessarily the weirdest kind of thing because this was something that was regularly collected by American soldiers as just a kind of souvenir in the first place. And then North Korea would go and release a video in which White would just criticize the US, saying that, oh, it was unjustifiable that US soldiers were there in South Korea, along with a whole bunch of other things that were just generally anti-American. Of course, we can't exactly 100% be certain as to what happened, but a US investigation that would occur that next month would conclude that, no, it appears that he willingly defected. And over the years, his parents would struggle with that knowledge. Eventually, President Reagan himself would actually write a letter to them trying to comfort them, but for the remainder of their lives, it was something that always broke them. His mother, Kathleen, would say in one interview, I don't understand. Why would Joey want to leave his ice cream, his chocolate syrup, and his money? Which, I don't know. We can't exactly say for certain as to why that is the case, and in comparison to any of the other people that we have talked about in this is the guy that we know the least about. He would write a single letter to his parents in the year 1983, and at the time he said that he was doing well, and that he was working as an English teacher, that he loved working with his North Korean students, that he still loved his family, and yada yada yada, all this other stuff. But he wouldn't really say anything about what had actually happened to him in the previous years, just what he was doing at that exact moment. And that's really it that we would hear from him. His family would receive another letter in 1985, except this one wasn't from him. Instead, it was from one of his friends who would tell the family that, unfortunately, he had died while attending a picnic with his friends, and he drowned in a river. That's it. That's really the end of his story. Really only a couple years long, and past that, we have no detail whatsoever about this guy. Which, looking at the end of this video here, that's not exactly the best note that I would like to end this thing on. But I think from everything that I've described, with the history, with the stories, with all of this, you can see why it is that I would want to cover this topic in the first place, because it really is interesting, and we don't know what is going to happen as a result of this. We cannot say for certain what will happen, and only time will tell, whether it will be a short little incident, or whether this is something that we're going to end up hearing about for the next 30, 40 years. Who knows? Maybe in the future, I'm going to have another very poorly made North Korean movie that I'm going to be able to review and cover over here on YouTube. Or maybe, like some of the other stuff, that is also going to end up being taken down. Who knows? Either way, everyone, thank you very much for watching. This has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. I ask that you like, comment, subscribe, and really show your love and support for this channel. I'm going to be doing whatever it is that I can to really switch up the style of how it is that I'm making and creating things on here, because as much as I love making content, the idea of my stuff being flagged either for copyright or being taken down because of not being eligible for advertisers or anything like that is something that really frustrates me, because I'm not doing anything that is provocative or bad, especially in the case of like with the previous video. So I'm going to have to be more careful with what it is that I do, but I appreciate all of your support. And if you really want to show me some love and help me to create this kind of content and teach these stories, then please make sure to check out my Patreon and other links down in my description. I appreciate all of you. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye, everyone.